Hey, third and fourth grade, great to see you. It's Miss O'Neill, and I'm back here ready to read you chapter 2 from this book, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's Magic. Chapter 2 is called The Thought You Setter's Cure. So we're going to look for a cure. Now, a thought you setter, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of a joke, and it's going to have some rhyming words. So, for example, if your mom said, "Go get me that stool," you would say, "Oh, I thought you said go jump in the pool." And so there's jokes, and listen very carefully while I read so you can get the little jokes. Lots of rhyming words. And anyway, we're going to have fun with this chapter. Okay, here we go. Chapter 2, The Thought You Setter's Cure. Mr. Burbank absently reached from behind his newspaper for the sugar bowl. So he's kind of like this, and he's reaching for the sugar bowl. His groping fingers hit the toast, the honeycomb, the salt cellar, and finally found the sugar bowl. His children, Darcy, Allison, and Baird, nudged each other and laughed. Every morning, Daddy felt around on the table for the sugar while he read bad news in the newspaper. One morning, the news was so bad that he was absent-minded and he put jelly into his coffee. The children were anxious for a repeat performance and hopefully pushed everything but the sugar bowl in the path of his searching hand. This morning, as soon as Mr. Burbank had found the sugar, he let the paper down with a bang. "The sugar bowl's empty," he said in a hurt way. Mrs. Burbank, who was buttering toast, said, "Darcy, run out to the kitchen and fill the sugar bowl, dear. The sugar's in the big red can." Darcy obediently got up, took the sugar bowl, and went out to the kitchen. After a long time, he came back to the breakfast table with a plate of cinnamon rolls. "What are these for?" said Father. "And where is the sugar?" "Sugar," said Darcy. "What about sugar?" "I told you to fill the sugar bowl," said Mrs. Burbank. "Oh," said Darcy, "I thought you said get the cinnamon roll." All three children looked at each other and laughed loudly. Finally, Mr. and Mrs. Burbank laughed too. Darcy went out and filled the sugar bowl, and Mr. Burbank, after 3 cups of coffee, missed his bus and decided to walk as far as the school with the children. Just as they were going out the front door, Allison remembered her math book and dashed upstairs for it. In a minute, she leaned over the banister and called, "Mother, did you see my math book?" Mrs. Burbank said, "What does it look like?" Allison said, "It's blue and not very thick." Mrs. Burbank said, "I think it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "How did it get there?" Mrs. Burbank said, "Out where? I said it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "Oh, I thought you said it's out in the stable in a stall." All three children roared with laughter. Allison found her math book, and they all left the house laughing and repeating, "Out in the stable in a stall?" Mr. Burbank said, come on, we haven't had all day." He walked briskly along the street, his footsteps ringing loudly and purposefully in the autumn air. The children giggled and jostled along behind him, their progress so even and broken by "thought you said" and shrieks of laughter that Mr. Burbank reached the corner first. In fact, almost before they had left the yard. He stopped to wait for them and to survey the city spread out below him in the morning sunshine. He was glad he lived on a hill. He was glad he was alive, and he was glad he had a little boy 9, a little girl 7, and a little boy 6. When the children had caught up with him, he said, "Look, children, see how beautiful the city looks from way up here? Watch the fog rise over there." "Where's the dog?" said Bard. "What dog?" said Darcy. "What color eyes are the dogs?" asked Allison. "What on earth are you talking about?" said Mr. Burbank. "I said watch the fog rise over there." "Oh," Bard said, "I thought you said watch the dog's eyes glare." All the children laughed and laughed. Mr. Burbank said, "What nonsense!" But it was a beautiful morning, so he laughed with his light-hearted children. When they were halfway down the next block, the children suddenly stopped, stock still, in front of a pretty white house, and yelled in unison, "Marilyn! Marilyn! Come on, we'll be late!" Mr. Burbank said, "That's no way to do it. If you want Marilyn, go up to the door and ask for her." The children looked surprised, but went obediently up to the door and rang the bell. Marilyn's mother opened the door and said something to the children which seemed to send them into convulsions. Laughing, doubled over with laughter, and holding their sides, they came down the walk to their father. "Now, what's so funny?" Mr. Burbank asked. Darcy said, "Marilyn's mother said Marilyn fell in the toaster and is burnt up dead." Mr. Burbank said, "What did Marilyn's mother really say, and why isn't Marilyn going to school?" Allison said, "She said Marilyn fell in her coaster and hurt her head, and Darcy thought she said Marilyn fell in the toaster and is burnt up dead." She went into another spit of laughter. Mr. Burbank didn't laugh. Instead, he bent down and examined Darcy's ears, which were large and pink and soft and quite clean. "They should work," said Mr. Burbank, looking at the other children's ears. They all seemed quite normal. The children wanted to know what he was doing. Baird said, "What are you doing? What are you doing that for, Daddy?" Mr. Burbank said, "I'm trying to decide whether I should get you an ear trumpet." "Beer crumpet? What's that?" Bard said. The other children repeated after him, "Beer crumpet, beer crumpet." They all laughed, but Mr. Burbank, who had had enough, he said, "Come on, I'll supervise a race to school. On your marks, get set, go." When Mr. Burbank reached his office, the very first thing he did was he made a call to Mrs. Burbank. He said, "Mary, have our children ever had scarlet fever?" She said, "Now you know they haven't, Bernard." "Well," he said, "have they ever had ear infections?" "Goodness, no," said Mrs. Burbank. "They've never had anything. They are the healthiest children in the neighborhood. What's the matter?" Mr. Burbank said, "Plenty. They can't, any of them, hear well. I told them to look at the fog rise, and they thought I was talking about dog's eyes. Marilyn's mother said that Marilyn fell off her coaster and hurt her head, and they thought she said Marilyn fell in the toaster and was burnt up dead." Mrs. Burbank finished for him. "Bernard, did you ever hear of anyone falling in a toaster?" "Of course not. There is nothing wrong with our children's ears. It's just that they are going through that awful thought you said phase." Here we go. "Well, let's get them out of it," said Mr. Burbank. "They sound like dopes. Dog's eyes indeed." Mrs. Burbank said, "Don't worry, dear. I'll take care of it." As soon as she finished talking to Mr. Burbank, Mrs. Burbank called Marilyn's mother to find out about Marilyn, if she was badly hurt, and if there was anything she could do. Marilyn's mother said Marilyn was just fine, but the doctor thought she should be quiet for a few days. When Mrs. Burbank asked Marilyn's mother if she had ever had any trouble with the thought you said, and told about the sugar bowl and the cinnamon rolls and the math book in the stall, about Marilyn's fall in the toaster and the dog's eyes, Marilyn's mother said, "Oh, Mrs. Burbank, I'm so glad you called and told me all of this. You see, Marilyn has been doing the same thing all morning. And I was terribly afraid that the blow on her head had affected her mind. When I asked her if she wanted crumpets or toast, she said, 'Bumped on the nose? Who?' When I asked her if her head pained her, she said, 'I thought you said, is the bed painted yet?'" Mrs. Burbank said, "I'm going to call up Mrs. Teagle and see if Terry or Teresa are thought-you-saiders. She is such a good manager that if they have thought-you-said-itis, she's probably thought of a cure. Marilyn's mother asked Mrs. Burbank to call her back if she got any useful information, and they said goodbye. Then Mrs. Burbank called Mrs. Teagle. Wait till you guys hear Mrs. Teagle's voice. She told her all about the Thought You Said-itis and asked if she had any similar experience with Terry or Teresa. Mrs. Teagle said, no, Mrs. Burbank. She emphasizes a lot. You see, we have always studied correct speech, and we all speak correctly. The children always pronounce all their vowels and all their consonants, and therefore we never have any trouble understanding each other. Perhaps the trouble lies with you and Mr. Burbank. Perhaps you do not speak distinctly. Perhaps the poor little children cannot understand you. I am holding little speech classes every afternoon, and if you or Mr. Burbank are interested, I would be glad to have you attend. I wouldn't care to have your children because I am afraid they might corrupt my children's perfect speech. I'm going to show you how the author typed this. So if you take a second, let's see. Hopefully you can see some of those words with extra letters in them to emphasize how she wanted this author wanted this character to be read. Mrs. Burbank thanked Mrs. Teagle for her kind offer and told her that perhaps she was right, that she and Mr. Burbank would try to speak more distinctly, and if things didn't improve within the week, they might join the speech class. Mrs. Teagle said, "Glad to be of help any time, Mrs. Burbank," and hung up. That night, when Mr. Burbank came home, she told him about calling Mrs. Teagle and told him that she thought that from now on they should both try to speak more carefully so that their poor little children could understand them. That night at dinner, Mr. Burbank announced in a very loud voice, "Please pass the butter." The children all exchanged glances and whispers, then laughed. The butter remained cool and comfortable on its little plate in front of Darcy. Mr. Burbank looked accusingly at Mrs. Burbank. She said in a high, unnatural voice, "Children, listen to me. Please pass your father the butter." "Oh," said Darcy, "did you say pass the butter? I thought you said fleas, gasp, and mutter." Allison said, "I thought you said he's Pa's mother." Bard said, "I thought you said freeze Pat's brother." Wacky. Mr. Burbank said in a low, grim voice, "I said, just please pass the butter." Darcy passed it to him with a beaming smile. The next morning after breakfast, Mr. Burbank called from upstairs, "Where's my briefcase? Anybody seen my briefcase?" Allison said, "Who's got a thief's face?" Darcy said, "Beef paste? What do you want that for?" Bard said, "Leaf race?" "I thought he said leaf race." They all laughed loudly and did not look for the briefcase. They could hear their mother and father banging doors and scuffling around upstairs, but they were so busy thought you setting, they didn't even notice that Bard was standing in front of the briefcase, which was leaning against the radiator in the front hall. Finally, Mr. Burbank came running down the stairs, wild-eyed and almost too late for his bus. He called to Mrs. Burbank, "If you find it, dear, bring it right down to the office. I must have it this morning." He slammed the front door and ran like the wind for his bus. Mrs. Burbank was giving the children their final inspection before school when she saw the briefcase leaning against the wall right behind Bard's fat little legs. She said, "Why, children, why didn't you tell Daddy his briefcase was down here? You must have seen it."